The smoke was still rising when Maren Voss reached the waterline. She had seen wreckage before. 17 years in the Interstellar Customs Enforcement Division gave you a catalog of disasters to file things against. Hull breaches, cargo detonations, the occasional interdiction gone ugly, but nothing in that catalog had a page for this. Nothing had a page for 412 humans who had been alive an hour ago and were not alive now, floating in the thermal shallows of Kepler Station's lower dock with the morning light, catching the debris around them like confetti, after a parade that had ended very badly. The transport vessel Ardent Grace had been carrying families, soldiers rotating home from the Vithani exclusion zone, and the people who loved them. Children. It was Fat Tuesday, on the station's Earth calendar. The holiday the dock crews still observed, the one with the music and the colored lights and the food carts, that smelled like something her grandmother used to make in a kitchen, on a planet she had not visited in 11 years. Maren stood at the edge of the dock and breathed through her mouth and did the job. She was good at the job. The 9th Division detectives who met her at the access corridor had already noticed. You could see it in the way they watched her move. The slight recalibration behind their eyes that happened when someone who was supposed to be a bureaucratic liaison turned out to be something else entirely. She did not explain herself. She crouched over the burn patterns on the dock plating and read them the way her first mentor had taught her. Like a sentence, not a picture. Every fire writes something down if you know how to read it. Shaped, she said, more to herself than to the detective hovering at her shoulder. What's that? The blast pattern. It's shaped. Someone put this together with care. She stood up and looked out at the water. This was not an accident. Detective Juan said nothing for a moment. Then, we know. The thing she found next was not supposed to be there. They had pulled a body from the thermal current 3 kilometers south of the blast site. Female, human, late 30s. The Vithani didn't take bodies. That much was already established doctrine. Already in the threat assessment files that Maren spent 6 months helping write. They consumed their dead. It was cultural, maybe biological. The xenobiologists were still arguing about it. But they did not leave bodies behind that had been killed by methods entirely unrelated to the blast. They did not leave bodies with injuries that predated the explosion by what the medical examiner was now telling Maren was somewhere between 4 and 8 hours. Her name was Solin Araya. She had a sister on Kepler Station who worked the agricultural ring. She had a subscription to a literary archives service and a potted herb garden in her quarters on level 7. And a truck, a heavy cargo hauler registered in her name, that was nowhere to be found in the debris field. Maren sat in the temporary field office they had set up in the customs bay and looked at Solin Araya's face on her datapad for a long time. You're the one they said might be able to figure this out, said a voice from the doorway. She looked up. The man was tall. Federal security, the kind who wore his rank loosely, the kind who had spent enough time in the field that authority had become casual rather than performed. Commander Ede Prahl. She had heard the name before distantly, attached to operations she did not have clearance for. I'm the one who read the blast pattern, Maren said. Same thing, he sat down across from her without asking. We have something we want to show you. The room they brought her to did not appear on any schematic of Kepler Station that Maren had ever accessed, which meant the schematic she had accessed was incomplete, which meant her security clearance was lower than she had assumed, which was fine. She adjusted her assumptions. There were 7 people in the room. 4 of them were technicians seated at consoles that ran a long curved arc along the far wall. One was a small, intense man, with the look of someone who had not slept in approximately the amount of time it took to build a surveillance array of this particular complexity. It was introduced as Dr. Call Fenris. One was Prahl, one was Maren. What am I looking at, she said. We call it the mirror, said Fenris. He gestured at the main display which was showing the agricultural ring on level 7. It's a temporal observation window. We can view any location within a roughly 4-kilometer radius of this station, displaced 98 hours, 22 minutes, and 14 seconds into the past. That's very specific. Physics is specific. Maren looked at the display. People were going about their day on level 7 4 days ago, before the explosion, before any of this. A child was running between the planters. 2 dock workers were eating lunch at a bench. Everything was ordinary in the particular way that ordinary things become unbearable once you know what comes after them. You've been watching, she said slowly, trying to find the Vithani operative, or operatives, whoever placed the device on the Ardent Grace. The mirror can show us the 98-hour window before the explosion, but only in real time. We can't fast forward. We see what we see when we see it. And what have you seen? Fenris looked at Prahl. Something passed between them. We keep looking at her, Prahl said. At Sol and Araya. She appears in 18 different locations across the 98-hour window. She seems to intersect with the perpetrator at multiple points. We think she was a witness to the device being placed, or possibly an unwilling asset. He paused. We think if we can reconstruct her final hours through the mirror, we'll find whoever did this. Marin looked at the screen. At level 7. At the ordinary people living in the last hours before the world broke. Show me, she said. They showed her. It took 4 days of sitting in that room, 4 days of watching a woman who was already dead move through her life in the past present of the mirror's display. And Marin did not expect what happened next, which was that Sol and Araya began to feel real to her, not as an evidence trail, as a person. She watched Solon feed the herb garden in the morning, moving carefully among the pots with the deliberate attention of someone who had once, probably, killed a lot of plants before learning how not to. She watched her argue cheerfully on a communications channel with someone named Davi, who was almost certainly her sister. She watched her laugh at something on the literary archive, a short, involuntary laugh that she cut off as if embarrassed to be caught laughing alone, and Marin found herself in the strange position of smiling in response in the present, at a woman who had been murdered before the smile was even a thought in anyone's head. This, she told herself, is not useful, and it was true, but it was also not entirely under her control. On the second day, she found the truck. The mirror tracked it through 3 different loading bays and a restricted maintenance corridor before she lost it in a blind zone between sensor clusters. The driver was not clearly visible. Helmet, dark worksuit, body language that managed to communicate nothing about height, weight, or species. But she could narrow the approach vector. She could find where the truck had come from. She started running the geometry. On the 3rd day, something impossible happened. She had been watching Solon's quarters, the herb garden, the morning light coming through the viewport, the ordinary textures of someone's private life. When she saw it, a small point of red light on the far wall of the room. It was there for perhaps 3 seconds, tracing a slow circle across the plaster beside the door, and then it was gone. Marin turned around. The technician behind her had a laser calibration tool in his hand, pointed at the screen. "Did you just?" she started. "I was checking the display alignment," he said, confused. "I wasn't thinking." Marin turned back to the screen. In the past, 4 days ago, Solon Araya was standing very still, staring at the circle of red light on her wall. Her head had come around with the sharp alertness of something startled. She was looking, in the recording, at a light source that had no origin in her world. A light that had come from a room that would not exist for another 4 days. "It went through," Marin said quietly. Fenris looked up from his console. "I'm sorry." The light, the laser. It passed through the mirror and appeared in the past. She turned back to face him, and she could feel something shifting in her chest, some tectonic adjustment of the possible. "The window is not one way." The room went very quiet. "That's not," Fenris began. "I just watched it happen," she said. "Don't tell me what it is." What followed was 11 hours of argument, 3 failed attempts to reproduce the effect with different calibration tools, and 1 successful attempt with a focused, coherent beam at precisely the right harmonic. And then suddenly the mirror was no longer just a window. It was a door, a partial door. Objects below a certain mass threshold could pass through. Information could pass through. Marin sat with this for a long time. The Vithani operative was still out there. The truck was still missing. 412 people were still dead, and she was sitting in a room with a machine that could reach back 4 days and change things. "We could send a message," she said. Prahl shook his head before she finished the sentence. "We don't know what that does to the timeline. Fenris's people think." "I know what Fenris's people think. I'm asking what we do." She leaned forward. "We know when the truck entered the restricted corridor. We know the approximate route. If we send a message to security 4 days ago, they intercept the operative before the device is placed. No explosion, no dead, no way of knowing what changes. 412 people change, from dead to alive. That seems like the relevant change. Marin." Prahl said her name carefully, the way people say names when they're trying to anchor someone. "We send a message back, we fork the timeline. What happens to this one? What happens to us? What happens to the version of events where the explosion already occurred and everything downstream of it? Including the security protocols we've already changed in response, the Vithani threat assessments, the diplomatic negotiations, that are happening right now based on the evidence from this attack. We pull the thread and we don't know what unravels. She knew he was right. She hated that he was right. She sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought about Solanaraya, laugh at something in a literary archive, laughing, and then cutting herself off as if embarrassed. "Send it to me," she said finally. "Send the message to me 4 days ago. I know my own protocols. I'll find a way to act on it without blowing the investigation." They sent the message. She wrote it herself. Coordinates, timestamp, a description of the truck precise enough to pick it out of a busy corridor. She wrote it on a strip of physical medium, polymer sheet, the kind that would survive the transit. And she watched Fenris's technicians feed it into the transmission aperture. And she felt the particular vertigo of knowing that somewhere in the past, in a version of herself that was also entirely herself, a piece of paper was about to appear from nowhere and change everything. It did not change everything. She found out later. 4 days later in the present, which is to say immediately, which is to say all at once, in the way that temporal consequence works, when you are standing at the receiving end of it, that the message had arrived. But she, 4 days ago, Marin, had not been in the room when it appeared. Her partner had been. His name was Sig Coulter, and he was the best investigator she had worked with in 17 years. And he had found the note and read the coordinates, and done exactly what any good investigator would do with a credible tip. He had gone to intercept the operative himself. He was killed in the maintenance corridor. Marin sat with this for a longer time. "I'm going through," she said. Prahl started to say something. "Sig is dead," she said, "because I sent that message. Because I wasn't there to get it myself. I am going to go back, and I am going to be there, and I am going to make sure this is done right." She looked at him steadily. "No one has ever gone through as a living person, which is a significant concern. I know. So let's be careful." Fenris spent 6 hours modifying the transmission aperture for biological mass transfer. He explained to her, in loving technical detail, everything that could go wrong. She listened carefully of it, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then said, "What's the procedure for the first 20 seconds after transit? Because I've been a field agent for 17 years, and the first 20 seconds are what you prep for. Everything else you improvise." He told her. She memorized it. She put on a fresh set of clothes, light, flexible, practical, and she ate a meal, a real meal, because she could not know how long it would be before she ate again, and she stood in front of the aperture and thought, briefly and without sentimentality, about the things she would be leaving in this version of the timeline if the transit failed. She had a sister on Callisto Station. She had a plant she had not managed to kill yet, after 7 months of trying. She thought about those things, for exactly the amount of time they deserved. And then she stepped through. The transit felt like being unmade and remade in the space of a held breath, like every atom of her being was briefly arranged in alphabetical order by a very fast and very precise machine. And then she was standing in a medical bay on Kepler Station, and the air smelled different, recycled differently, cycled through different filters, because 4 days ago the carbon array on sublevel 3 had a different filter configuration. She remembered that from the maintenance logs, and she knew she had made it. She had 42 minutes before Sig Coulter died in the maintenance corridor. She moved. She found him in the customs bay, reading her note, the note she had written from the future. The note that was already, now, 4 days old in its own past. The note that she had being fed into a machine, while Sig stood 600 meters away, and did not know it was coming. She saw his face change when he read it. She saw him stand up. "Sig," she said. He turned startled. "Voss, I thought you were in the field office." "Don't go to that corridor," she said. "I know what that note says. I know where it sent yo. Don't go." He stared at her. "How do you know what?" "It's a long explanation and we don't have time for it right now. What we have time for is getting to that corridor with backup and doing this correctly." She was already moving toward the door. "Come on. I'll explain while we run." She explained while they ran. He did not believe her. He was also running alongside her, which was the relevant thing about Sig Coulter. He was the kind of person who acted on evidence before he finished processing it, who trusted the data stream before he trusted his own skepticism. He didn't believe in time travel, and he was keeping up with her anyway. "So in your version of events," he said, slightly breathless, "I went in alone, yes. And you died. A beat." His footsteps didn't change rhythm. "That's inconvenient. Yes. And we're going to do better than that. That's the plan." They came around the corner of Corridor 7 Gamma with 2 additional security officers they had picked up on the way. She had told them enough to get compliance, not enough to require explanation. And the figure in the dark work suit was exactly where the mirror had shown her it would be, crouched at a junction panel, inserting something into the station's freight routing system that absolutely should not be there. Not a Vithani, as it turned out. A human working for Vithani interests, which was somehow worse. The particular awfulness of betrayal having a geometry that pure enemy action didn't. The operative ran. Of course he ran. She had not expected anything different. What followed was the longest 12 minutes of Marin Voss's professional life. The operative was fast and he knew the maintenance corridors better than she did, which she logged as a significant disadvantage. And he had a sidearm that he was not reluctant to use, which she logged as a more significant disadvantage. And he had apparently anticipated some version of interception, because he had a secondary device on his person, a smaller charge, less catastrophic than the one he'd loaded into the truck, but still enough to take out the dock control systems and create a window for extraction. She saw him reach for it when she came around the third corner, and she made a decision she had been building toward for the last 4 days, without knowing it was a decision she was building toward. She moved left when he expected right. She had watched him in the mirror for 98 hours, and she had, without deliberately cataloging it, assembled a model of how he moved. The slight overextension on the right side, the hesitation before he committed to a direction, the way he led with the weapon before his body followed, which gave you a half-second window if you were close enough and willing to accept the cost of being close enough. She was close enough. She took the hit on her left shoulder, which was not nothing, but was also not the alternative. And she put him on the ground with the kind of efficiency that 17 years of field work deposits in your body, without your conscious participation. He went down. He stayed down. The secondary device hit the floor and skidded under a coolant pipe, and she was already moving to secure it before it finished skidding. Sig was at her elbow 3 seconds later. He looked at the operative on the ground, and then at her shoulder, and then at the device under the pipe. "You're bleeding," he said. "I know. Significant amount. I'm aware. Help me get this secured, and then you can be as concerned about my shoulder as you want." He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that happened in the gap where fear had been, short, involuntary, slightly embarrassed. She had seen Solon Araya make exactly that sound in the mirror, laughing at something in a literary archive. She thought for a moment about the fact that Solon Araya was still alive in this version of the timeline, was still feeding her herb garden, was still arguing cheerfully with her sister Davi, was still a person in the world. The truck with the main device was impounded 40 minutes later. The bomb squad spent 6 hours with it. The Ardent Grace departed on schedule the following morning, with 412 passengers who remained, for the rest of their lives, entirely unaware of the particular catastrophe that had not happened to them. Marin's shoulder required 11 stitches and a significant amount of anesthetic, which meant she was sitting in a medical bay when Prahl found her. "How?" was all he said. "I went back," she said. "Like we said. You shouldn't exist here. You already existed here. 4 days ago there was already a Marin Voss on this station. And now there are 2 of us." She examined the neat row of stitches. "Or there will be, until the other version of me goes through the mirror." He sat down. He had the look of a man trying to find the walls of a room that turned out not to have any. "And the other you, past you, she'll go through. Because she doesn't know this version exists. She'll still feel responsible for Sig. She'll still go through. She'll still land in a medical bay 4 days from now and find out that things are already resolved." Marin looked up at him. "Which is going to be a very strange experience for her. For me. Phenomenologically, I mean." Prahl rubbed his face. "This is an absolute mess. The families of 412 people get to see them come home," Marin said. "I'm at peace with the mess." She was discharged from the medical bay 6 hours later. She had been told to rest, which she interpreted as, "Return to your quarters and sit still for 30 minutes before returning to work." She was 3 minutes into the 30 minutes when her door chimed. The person on the other side was her, or a version of her. The other, Marin Voss, the one who had gone through the mirror in the other direction, who had, in her own subjective timeline, just stepped out of the aperture and found the bay gate already sealed, the operative already in custody, the station already continuing on its ordinary axis. She looked exactly as Marin remembered looking 4 days ago, which was to say, like someone who had been sitting in a surveillance room for 4 days watching a dead woman live her life and had come out of it with a specific determination that had nowhere left to go. They stood in the doorway and looked at each other. Sig's alive, Marin said. Other Marin's eyes closed briefly. When they opened, something had shifted in them. The truck? Impounded. The operative is in detention. The ardent Grace departed on schedule. A long silence. You did it, we did it. You built the plan. I executed it. Marin stepped back from the door. Come in. I have something that is technically tea, and you are going to need to sit down for the part where I explain the timeline implications. Other Marin came in. She sat down. She looked at Marin's shoulder, at the bandage, and the slight stiffness in the way she carried herself, and said nothing for a moment. You got shot. A little bit. I got a shot. You got a shot in a version of events where Sig Coulter went alone into a maintenance corridor and didn't come back. You did the math on that, and you made a different call. Marin handed her the tea. I would have made exactly the same call. You did make exactly the same call. You are me. Yes, another silence, more comfortable this time. What happens now? Other Marin said. To me, to this version. I don't know, Marin said. Fentress thinks the timelines will eventually consolidate. He's not certain. He is certain that you have the same security credentials I do, the same 17 years of field experience, and that the station has a significant investigative backlog. Other Marin looked at her over the rim of the cup. The same look Marin had seen on her own face in mirrors for decades. The look that meant she was doing the math and the math was coming up with something she hadn't expected. You're suggesting we work together. I'm suggesting we're the same person who had one of the stranger days in recorded law enforcement history, and probably shouldn't spend it alone. Marin leaned back carefully, mindful of the shoulder. Besides, you've had 4 days of mirror access that I don't have anymore. There are patterns in that footage I didn't finish analyzing. The operative in custody is human, which means there's a Vethani handler somewhere in the 9-station cluster who is about to find out this operation failed. That person is going to make a decision in the next 72 hours about whether to escalate or go quiet. She looked at her other self steadily. I want to be ready for that decision. Other Marin set down the cup. You already have a plan. I have the beginning of a plan. Tell me, Marin told her. The investigation ran for 31 more days. 31 days of the mirror in the customs bay and Sig Coulter making pointed comments about her shoulder whenever she lifted anything she wasn't supposed to lift. 31 days of 2 Marin Vosses navigating the peculiar intimacy of working beside yourself, of knowing every habit and shortcut and mistake before it happened and choosing still to let the other person find their own way through it. It was stranger than she had expected, which was saying something, because she had expected it to be very strange. They did not always agree. That surprised her most. She had assumed that 2 identical people would reach identical conclusions, which turned out to be wrong in a way that Fenris found scientifically very interesting, and that Marin found humanly very ordinary. They had started from the same point, and 4 days of different experience had already begun to angle them apart. Not much, degrees. But degrees, maintained over 31 days, became something you could see. Other Marin, who had, somewhere around the 3rd week, started going by Solon, not because it was her name, but because the name was available and she needed one, and because there was a woman who should be alive in this timeline, and naming herself after that woman was the most private kind of memorial she knew how to make, was slightly more patient, slightly more willing to wait for confirmation before moving. Marin, who had been the one to step through the aperture and take the hit in the corridor, was slightly more willing to accept cost. Together they were very good. The Vethani handler's name was, in the Vethani phonemic system, something approximately like a sound made by 2 stones striking each other in cold water. The Federal Security Translation Team rendered it as Karath, and Marin found this inadequate and also did not have a better option, so Karath it was. Karath had been operating in the 9-station cluster for 3 standard years under a diplomatic cover that was, in retrospect, technically impeccable. The paperwork was real. The credentials were real. The diplomatic role was real. What was not real was the allegiance. Marin got to Karath on day 31, in a cargo transfer bay on the outer ring, in a confrontation that lasted 6 minutes and involved 2 security officers, Solon covering the secondary exit, and Marin herself walking into a bay where a 4-meter Vethani with full-spectrum bioluminescent threat display was waiting to renegotiate the terms of engagement. She had a moment walking into that light. The cold blue-white radiance of a Vethani in full threat configuration, the way it filled the room and pushed at the hindbrain, where she understood the full weight of what humans were doing out here, the weight of it. Other species had their own geometries of power, The Vithani's bioluminescence was not metaphorical. It was not display for its own sake. It was a direct neurochemical action, evolved over 100,000 years, designed to create physiological submission in competing species. It worked, a little. She felt it working. She kept walking anyway. There was something specifically human about that, she thought. Not the bravery. She did not feel particularly brave. Brave implied a clean absence of fear, and she was not clean of it. The fear was present, doing what fear did, clanging around in the mechanism of her. She felt it, and she walked through it the way she had walked through the transmission aperture. Because the alternative was Sig Coulter going into a corridor alone. Because the alternative was 412 people who did not come home. Because the alternative was Solon Araya, not getting to be embarrassed about laughing alone in her quarters at something she found funny. She walked into the light. She said, "Kareth, we know what you are. We know who you work for. We have the operative in custody, and we have his testimony. And we have 31 days of mirror footage, and I am going to give you one opportunity to make this easier than it has to be." The light shifted. Colors moved through it. A Vithani emotional spectrum she had memorized from the xenobiology briefings. Cycling through what the briefings identified as threat assessment, calculation, something that might be curiosity. The bioluminescence of an extremely old species thinking very fast. "You are one human," Kareth said. The Vithani had excellent standard. "Alone. I'm not alone," Marin said. "And I'm not just one." She said it simply, the way you say a true thing. Without performance, without the kind of emphasis that signals you want the other person to be impressed. Just the fact of it. "I'm not alone and I'm not just one," meaning Sonzelin at the secondary exit, meaning the two security officers bracketing the entrance, meaning. And this was the part that did not fit neatly into a tactical briefing. The particular accumulated weight of what it meant to be a species that had learned to reach back through time and catch its own dead before they fell. Kareth did not surrender quietly. The next 4 minutes were not quiet, but they were conclusive. Afterwards, sitting on a cargo crate with a second injury to the same shoulder that was going to require a significantly less amused medical bay team, Marin watched Kareth being taken into custody and thought about the ferry explosion that had not happened. She thought about the families who had come to the dock to meet the Ardent Grace and found it arriving on schedule, intact, the way it was supposed to arrive. She thought about 412 people stepping off a vessel and being met by the people who loved them, without any knowledge, ever, of what had almost not been true. Solon sat down beside her. She had field medic kit open, and was already assessing the shoulder with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had learned, over the past 31 days, exactly how stubborn her other self was about medical attention. "You didn't have to take the front," Solon said. "Yes, I did. That's debatable." "You're more patient than I am," Marin said. "Patient people cover exits. Impatient people walk into the light." Solon was quiet for a moment, wrapping the shoulder with practiced hands. "Do you think Fenris is right? About the timelines consolidating? I don't know. If they do, then we become the same person again. Or we don't. Or we become something new that's neither of us specifically." Marin looked at her, at herself. At this woman who had spent 31 days becoming someone slightly different from the person she had been, who had named herself after a dead woman as a private memorial, who was wrapping a wound with the careful attention of someone who had decided that the person beside her was worth taking care of. "I've stopped trying to work out the physics of it. That seems wise." Fenris would disagree. Solon laughed, the short involuntary laugh, the one she still cut off slightly too soon, and Marin felt the vertigo of recognizing it from both directions. She had watched Solon Araya make that sound in the mirror for 4 days. She had heard herself make it in a medical bay when the cost of the shoulder hit her somewhere unexpected. It was the sound that humans made when the relief was bigger than the space they had prepared for it. She heard it and she thought, alive. She is alive. They are alive. The ferry arrived and they are all alive. The ones who did not know it should have gone any other way. Outside the cargo bay, through the viewport that looked out over the lower dock, Kepler Station was going about its business. Ships arrived. Ships departed. The agricultural ring on level 7 turned in its slow rotation, and somewhere in it, a woman was tending herb pots and arguing cheerfully with her sister on a comm channel and laughing some in a literary archive, without anyone watching her through a temporal window that did not belong in her world. Marin leaned back against the cargo crate and let her other self finish wrapping the wound. It was enough. It was against all odds and through mechanisms that Fenris would spend the next 3 years trying to fully explain, exactly enough. When the investigation closed, there were 2 Marin Vosses on Kepler Station. They filed separate reports, they had separate quarters. They drank the same tea and reached slightly different conclusions about the same problems, and covered each other's exits with the particular reliability of someone who knows, at a fundamental level, exactly how the other person thinks. The Federal Security Division, which had seen a great deal and was not easily surprised, filed this under ongoing temporal anomaly, resolved and moved on. Prahl, on his last day before rotating out to a new posting, stopped in the corridor outside the customs bay where both of them happened to be working. "I'm not going to pretend I understand what happened here," he said. "Neither do we," Marin said. "Fully," Solon said. He looked at both of them for a moment. That look again, the slight recalibration, the adjustment of the possible. And then he nodded. Once, the way people nod when they have decided to accept something they cannot fully contain. "Good work," he said. "Both of you." He left. The customs bay settled back into its ordinary sounds. Through the viewport, the lower dock gleamed in the shisha light, empty of smoke, full of arrivals, every berth accounted for. Marin picked up her datapad. Solon picked up hers. They went back to work.